So hello, I'm Dana Seitler, and I'm the director of the Bonham Centre for Sexual Diversity Studies at the University of Toronto. The Bonham Centre is located on the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, and the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This means we are all treaty peoples, and we are all responsible for honoring and upholding these agreements. We are grateful for the opportunity to live and work on this territory and to share space with all of you. So I would like to officially welcome you to the first annual Martha L.A. McCain Postdoctoral Fellowship Lecture. The Bonham Centre established this postdoctoral fellowship in 2019 to support junior scholars pursuing research in sexual diversity studies. We were able to do so as a result of the generous support of Martha McCain, and for that we thank her. Every year, the McCain Postdoctoral Fellow is invited to deliver a public lecture that highlights their work, and this year we have the true privilege to hear from Sara Shroff. So Sara Shroff is the postdoctoral fellow at the Bonham Centre this year. She holds a PhD in urban and public policy from the New School in New York City. As a queer, feminist, transnational scholar, her work takes up the mutual constitution of race, coloniality, cultural memory, and sexuality in contemporary South Asia and its diasporas. She is the author of Honor as Property Relations, Tacky Promiscuities, and the Sexual Politics of Techno-Necro-Capitalism in the Economics of Empire, Pious Capital, Fashionable Femininity and the Predicament of Financial Freedom in Third World Thematics, and Modestly Modern, Mapping the Pakistani Muslim Working Woman in the Handbook of Gender in Asia, among many others. So please join me in welcoming Sara Shroff, who will be presenting to us, whose presentation to us today is called Between Brown Femininities, Queer Notes on Language, Erotics, and Devotion. So welcome, sweetie. Yeah. Good to see you.
I want to echo TL that I am so both overwhelmed and so humbled by this opportunity, and I'm just so grateful to see all of your faces. So please keep your cameras on. I'd love to see your faces. Actually give me so much life. And it is happy hour somewhere and it's chai time somewhere. So please indulge in your favorite beverages. I know it's 4 p.m., but whatever, you know, COVID time. So I'll speak for about maybe 30 to 40 minutes. And then we'll open it up to Q&As or comments or reactions. All are welcome. So I want to begin by thanking Dana and our team at the Center for Sexual Diversity Studies, especially Valley, Tori, and Cam. This talk is made possible by the labor, stories, warmth, and support of so many fellow travelers. I'm especially indebted to my kin, my mentors, my students, my friends, and my lovers for laboring with me, for being such generous co-thinkers. It is so heartwarming and so full of feelings to see so many of you in the audience today. For those of you that are joining us from different time zones, thanks for staying awake, I see you. Or waking up in the middle of the night, I see you too. For all of you here today, I'm so grateful for your presence, your energies, and for attending yet another Zoom talk. I'm definitely channeling the power of the full moon today and look forward to our conversations later. Zenana, enclosure, intimacy, inside, woman, desire, private, protected, sacred, relational, embodiment, an orientation and attachment to space, a home, a language of belonging, a space for those exiled and dispossessed. I returned to the zenana of my childhood home of 1980s Karachi. I returned to the space I ran away from as a young girl. I returned to the women who loved me, the women who hated me, the women who raised me, to our shared intimacies, our language, our glances, our metaphors and mischief, our curses and our conflicting grammars. I returned to these spaces and I learned how to cultivate my own zenana, erotic, queer, lesbian, feminist, brown, feminine, and sacred. I returned to these spaces because I am a feminist scholar interested in South Asian sexual archives and the shifting meaning and possibilities of brownness and femininity. I'm thinking about zenana not as a nostalgic place to rescue, but rather a relational space between brown femininities to get at its contradictions, intimate infrastructures, assignment and arrangement of bodies, languages, and desires. So today I want to mediate on zenana, spaces between brown femininities, between brown women, grandmothers, mothers, sisters, aunts, daughters, friends, and working class beauticians, also known as vaxvalis. I think about the zenana because I want to bring into dialogue the ways in which women of a particular time, class, family structure, and spiritual belief came to understand what brownness and womanness and desire meant within the constraints and mandates of respectable post-colonial Pakistani womanhood. I take up the elite heterosexual Pakistani zananas in which I was born and raised, and the brown diasporic femme zenana I cultivate in my life now. I'm guided by the following questions. How can zenana be attentive to global South epistemologies to understand gender and sexual politics of race, ethnicity, class, caste, diaspora, divinity, and domestic space? Can zenana be reimagined as a subversive spatial politics and a semiotic of sexuality to become otherwise and build other worlds? What would it mean to think about zenana as a queer experiment of space, a trans-feminist ethics, a coalitional strategy, and what Jackie Alexander and Lata Mani might call sacred workspace? So zenana is a Persian, Urdu, and Hindi word, which means of women and feminine soul. Historically, the zenana was analogous to harem, denoting colonial fantasies of naked, submissive, and leisurely women of imperial and elite Muslim and Hindu households. Often romanticized as the, what Geeta Patel, these are her quotes, sanctum sanctorum of the house, or reduced to the spatial equivalent of the whale. Zenana entered into feminist and queer conversations as a highly contested, ideologically overdetermined space. Transnational feminist scholars who take up diaspora and South Asian sexual archives, such as Geeta Patel, Gayatri Gopinath, and Anjali Arondekar, have challenged the binary frame grafted onto sexual archives and gendered segregated spaces that reduce them to sites of colonial fascination or sites of queer freedom. Evoking their work, I illuminate how power, desire, class, spirituality, and respectability move through these spaces marked as women only, while also cementing the very category we understand as women. In the South Asian post-colonial imagination, zenana emerged as a respectable class space, which was not explicitly sexual and was instead seen as domestic, private, unsullied by formal political power, and inherently about performing heteronormative womanhood and all of its aesthetic mandates. Between these colonial and post-colonial fantasies, many zenanas were destroyed, displaced, or ostracized to the margins, sacrificed in the name of nation, capitalism, patriarchy, and religion. These included zenanas of tawaifs, devdasis, sex workers, dancers, musicians, healers, performers, entertainers, streetwalkers, migrant workers, enslaved and indentured women, poor women, queer women, and trans women. Some Khwaja Sira and trans women refer to themselves as zenana, meaning feminine soul. These zenanas as bodies, as spaces, and as souls came to be seen as sites of moral degradation, deviant desire, disease, failed masculinity, and dishonorable and fractured femininity. The multiple and moving meanings of zenana, and more specifically, the in-between spaces of the zenana, the honorable and the deviant, the domestic and the feminine, the divine and the erotic, the play and the discipline, the destruction and the recreation, makes zenanas a fleshy and fissured site of theorizing. I often think about what a theoretical endeavor around zenana means. Perhaps an invitation, perhaps a haunting, perhaps an inheritance, perhaps a motherland, or maybe just some stories. Story 1. I begin with my first memories of waxing. I grew up in 1980s urban Karachi in a multi-generational, upper-class patriarchal family. I loved those summer afternoons when my mother, married and unmarried paternal aunts, cousins, and grandmother would gather in my grandmother's room to undress, ready to be waxed, threaded, and plucked. On these afternoons, my grandmother's room was referred to as ladies only. It was during these sweaty, sticky afternoons of bikini waxing through the tear of flesh and fabric, eyebrow threading with cotton strands, and plucking coarse hair from breasts that I came to understand the zenana as the bitter sweetness behind gendered segregation. Bano Appa, an older, darker-skinned Muslim woman and a working-class entrepreneur in her 50s, was our waxing and threading expert. She used a butter knife for applying the wax on my legs and arms, under my arms, and between my legs. The wax was made from slowly heating lemon juice, sugar, and water. Torn up jeans or pillow covers of roughly 6-inch rectangles were used to press the sugar onto the skin like butter, and once firmly stuck, quickly ripped off for best results. Over the last 25 years, my mother has taught me, my cousins, and many of my friends how to make the wax and scissor the thread during her visits in Atlanta, New York, and Washington, D.C. I learned threading from Bano Appa and still use a knife some days. It was only recently that I realized that what I had learned as waxing is in fact called sugaring, also known as Persian waxing. Sugaring is a technique of hair removal much older than waxing and traces its roots to ancient India, ancient Egypt, and Persia. My downtown Toronto salon markets sugaring as organic, gluten-free, and a natural alternative to waxing. Their marketing materials mask the intimate, imperial, and racial histories of violence and labor and commodification that allowed sugar to become not just edible, but a critical ingredient of beauty products. That sugar was brought to Europeans by the Arab Islamic Empire and then became a colonial commodity that fueled Euro-American empires, connects these sticky, sweaty, femi afternoons to the violence and indentureship of Black and brown bodies from South Asia to the Americas, the Caribbean, and the Africas. Sugaring and threading connects my body and the making of my brown femininity to multiple empires and the histories of Black and brown diasporas. So while sugaring was about removing and taming unwanted hair, threading, also a practice that emerged from Asia and Persia, was about shape, detail, and precision. Threading twists cotton thread to grip and yank out the hair at the roots. Threading eyebrows into an arch was seen as a marker of sexual maturity and marriageability, both of which were marked by a particular attention to the eyes, and the eyes become an invitation to desire, to look, and to flirt. This invitation to desire and to invite desire is routed through patriarchal fantasies of control. Perhaps this is why I grew up with the instruction to lower my gaze, not invite male desire, discipline my femininity, and cover my body. It was in the zenana that I learned about the contradictions of desire, expectation, and respectability from the women who lived them, who had to perfect them, even if only to fail. These spaces and relationships I grew up with were full of love, but not always loving. They were communal, but relied on class, caste, and color hierarchies. I learned that a woman with visible body hair was ugly, disobedient, unkept, rebellious, and manly. I learned the concept of ideal weight and skin color while being among women. It was in these rooms that I saw the women in my family in their most nakedness, exfoliating their skin, bleaching their brownness, massaging their curves, and preparing their bodies for the labor of heterosexual sex. The space was created by and for women away from men, yet the specter of the heterosexual gaze, male gaze, was simultaneously omnipresent and irrelevant. So too was the exploitative structure of color, caste, and caste, as this space was shaped by the transaction of working class women ripping hair off more bodies of more elite women. I am darker in complexion to my grandmother, and she and my mother would always insist on scrubbing me down with yogurt, rosewater, and chickpea flour, a homemade scrub for cleansing and ultimately lightening. Perhaps this is why my mother does not approve of my summer tans, and my grandmother called me Kali. Kali is a term with multiple meanings. Kali is a South Asian goddess of death, time, violence, and destruction. She's also worshipped as a symbol of sexuality, divinity, and motherly love, embodying a feminine energy of creativity, fertility, and pleasure. Kali also means dark or black in Urdu and Hindi. It is used as a pejorative term, often to indicate lack of desirability, an anti-black and anti-brown semantic gesture that polices and renders inadequate the person to whom it is being targeted. Light skin continues within post-coloniality to be considered better, purer, and cleaner. The instant lesson in heteropatriarchal capitalist success was that whiteness and its accompanying products was the solution to all the problems for Pakistani women. Whiteness as a mechanism through which our brownness could be cleansed. The zenana space was rife with sex jokes, gossip, recipes, politics, alternative medicine, and children. This sometimes included us as children being banished into the corner as timeouts. But really, these afternoons were the timeout for the women in my family. They sat and moved differently, less composed, less cautious, less serious. They sat with their legs wide open on the floor, visible, relaxed, stretched. I felt them letting go of the ways they were trained in and were training me in with instructions like, Sida baitho, sit straight, tange band karo, close your legs, and my favorite playful one-liner, kha kha ki kam karo, laugh less. Laying on the couch, draped over a pillow, or sitting on the floor, squatted with one leg stretched, they practiced no discretion with language and taught me how the body and mouth moves and feels when women take up space, when feminine energy makes space, when brown bodies, hips, thighs, breasts, and vulvas take center stage. In these afternoons, they laughed, talked, and tried to let go of the everyday violence of bourgeois womanhood and compulsory heterosexuality while simultaneously training me in both. Bano Appa had been coming to our homes for years and had seen the family, women, in this intimate space and state of nakedness for years. She was the first one to do my Brazilian bikini wax when I was 8. My mother held my hand, caressing my forehead, while Bano Appa busied me in conversation and carefully, for the first time, pulled what she jokingly called my baby bush. The idea behind starting these hair removal rituals early is so that budding follicles can be tamed and hair growth truncated. Bano Appa's wax was homemade and her hands were steady, caring, and swift. I still screamed and cried, and all the women laughed a laugh they had all laughed before. Their laughter meant different things. They were teaching me how to take pain, how to enjoy pain, what it means to laugh with pain, because they were living with different kinds of pain themselves. This was a ritual of an initiation into idealized femininity. This is where I learned that idealized femininity is about class and cultural and female servitude. This is where I learned that pain can be erotic, pain can be enjoyable. Over time, I developed an intimacy with the working class beauticians, but the intimacy created and cultivated in the zenanas between women in my family and between the women workers were fraught. The zenana was ours, built on their working class labor and our desire for comfortable afternoons and a hairless body. There was and continues to be a class, caste, and color dynamic in the room that is inescapable and tragic and reproduced at every corner, in every conversation, even if and when it is softened by laughter, teasing, secrets, and nakedness. These zenana spaces were temporal, intentional sites where intimacy was conditional and also conditioned. As a young girl, I was often amazed what stories my mom chose to share in these spaces, which episodes she would omit and alter, and when she seemed sad, exhausted, or happy. I was equally confused by what encounters these women chose to repeat, dilute, or hold on to. The women in my family did not directly discuss their own navigation of gender and sexual violence, despite the physical evidence. Instead, they talked in silence, in code, articulating anger through jokes, and in vocabularies of normalcy, of essence, of excuse, and of fate. These feminist grammars were couched in elite respectability and protection from each other. Their speech and their silence was dictated by their differently situated power and role in these rooms. The relations in the zenana was both promiscuous and bodily, but also full of caution and lies. This caution and lies were driven by the fear to maintain men's honor, fear of repeated violence, and if I'm to be even more honest, simply habit. Lying was what these women were used to. This lying was how these women navigated the repeated injuries and strains of compulsory heterosexuality. I read this habit, this routine of lying, as part of what Sara Ahmed calls repetitive strain injury. Curse words in Urdu, Hindi, and Gujarati were in ample use by all the women. They included Mother Chod, Bhen Chod, Bhosrini, Chutia, Chut, Rand, Randi, and Haramzadi. These translate varyingly as motherfucker, sister fucker, pussy hole, of the pussy, pussy, prostitute, and bastard. I actually first heard these words as insults, as terms men use socializing with other men or to discipline women and working class men. But it was in these women-only spaces I learned what these words could do. These women would laugh so hard, excuse me, these women would laugh so hard that it would make them dash to the bathroom holding their belly. It was between these swear words and their roaring belly laughter I saw some things. I saw fear, strength, solidarity, mischief, desire, and masochism. I saw how the women in my family had attached their survival to their heteropatriarchal bourgeois status and the violence they knew. A common aphorism they used and circulated and waxed philosophical about was, "Shadi ka laddu jo na khaye wo pachtaye, jo khaye wo bhi pachtaye." Marriage is like a decadent ball-shaped dessert. If you taste it, you'll regret it. And if you don't taste it, you'll miss out. Given these women's disdain for heterosexuality, this silly saying captured the caricature and disdain with which they saw both compulsory heterosexuality and the phallus. Indeed, the pun was intended. So despite being ardent critics of marriage, seeing marriage as useless, violent, exploitative, depressive, axiogenic, a fuckery of sorts, if not a total dead end, they still coached me on how to become marriage material. It was in these zananas that I became a lover of women, their bodies, their aesthetics, their energies, their gestures, their styles, their mischief, their warmth, their differences, and their tongues. This is where I learned about men's desires and men's rage, and where I was schooled on the dimensions of desirable ideal femininity as hairless, honorable, and heterosexual. These afternoons speak to the gendered and sexualized politics that emerge and submerge out of these women-only spaces. The lessons we learned about heteronormative forms, skin color, class hierarchy, and caste politics, about belonging, purity and impurity, and properly groomed bodies. I'm still unlearning some of these racist, casteist, sexist, homophobic, and transphobic lessons. In the shadow of my mom, between powerful women and painful fights, I learned the best strategies to taunt lovers and theorize love. It was in these spaces that I became a woman. It was in between these spaces that I became a woman who loves women. This is the Pakistan I was growing up in. Over time, as I grew older, these rituals became less frequent. I migrated to Singapore, the UK, and then to the US, with several returns back to Pakistan. Our joint family became smaller and quasi-nuclear, and eventually everyone would get waxed in their own private bedrooms or head to one of the neighborhood high-end salons. The 1970s and the 1980s in Pakistan marked the merger of Islamization and neoliberalization, the emergence of the citizen consumer, and an increase in foreign remittances from non-resident Pakistanis. Pakistan's first fast food chain, Mr. Burger, opened in 1980. Perhaps this is why my generation of elite Pakistanis are called burgers. The clothing brand Generation was also launched as one of the first ready-to-wear fashion labels in 1983, symbolizing a shift from the customization of fabric to the commodification of fashion. Over the years, store-bought wax replaced homemade wax. Factory-made waxing sheets replaced torn jeans and pillow covers, and popsicle sticks came to be seen as safer applicators compared to the steel knife. These days, I get my eyebrows threaded every 2 weeks. Well, not these days, but generally. At an Irani-owned salon in North York, or by Irani women at the salon on Bloor and Bathurst. These Irani women are in their mid-40s, and our conversations move between sex jokes, diasporic life, aging parents, and recipe for homemade scrubs for ingrown hair. They remind me of the women I knew in Karachi. Story 2. There are times when I do not know whether my mother has always been a lesbian or is becoming one with me. I say this because my mother always makes sweeping statements such as, all women are lesbians, we are all lesbians, or being a lesbian doesn't mean you need to leave your hetero marriage. She has made these statements to me when visiting me in Brooklyn, where I lived during my doctoral studies after my divorce, to my cousin at her end of her decade-long marriage and scandalous coming out, to me again when she met one of my many lovers, to groups of friends, to her own sisters and sister-in-laws over chai, dirty conversation about sex. She made these statements notoriously and unapologetically. But my mother's understanding and evocation of lesbian and her constant use of it in jest and seriousness was initially unintelligible to my scholarly training. It was decades until I understood that this utterance gestured towards a heterogeneous range of desires and survival strategies, that the erotic was far more capacious than the heterosexual and the homosexual matrix, that lesbianism can and does emerge out of class dynamics and sacred formations, and that my mother, like so many brown women, lived and breathed their life on the lesbian continuum. This, like the complex zenana of my youth, was among my first lessons in what I now understand as Black and brown erotic archives, deviant femininity, and lesbian mothering. Here I'm thinking about the work of Jackie Alexander, Omisika Natasha Tinsley, Amber Musser, Moon Charania, Jordash Elapin, and Shelja Patel. When my mother evokes the term lesbian, she is not evoking a sexual category, divorced from class, gender, ethnicity, religiosity, or nation. Rather, lesbian for my mother is a methodology, a set of methods, and an ethics for care, erotics, and imagination. It is part of a solidarity practice that emerges and is cultivated from a shared sense of harm. Thus, I see lesbian, like the zenana, as an activation of a different set of relations that are enmeshed in heteropatriarchy and racial capital, but are still not entirely determined by these frames. To draw from Jose Esteban Munoz, a disidentification that allows us to be, even as we are not meant to be. In this way, lesbian, like the zenana, is a relational space. It took me years to find Urdu expressions of lesbianism. Obsessively, fetishistically, madly, I began searching for a language, both for scholarly purposes and for a more intimate, meaningful grammar for Urdu and Hindi speaking women like myself. I returned to the phrase I often heard, hum jins parast. Hum jins parast is an Urdu term used for all forms of same-sex relations. The phrase, while not new, was only intelligible or legible to me as an insult, as a slur used especially to publicly vilify and humiliate women who were standing up for social justice struggles across Pakistan. The phrase was used to discredit the women and their activism on news and social media as un-Islamic, unpatriotic, and immoral. Hum jins parast is a phrase that is part of what Durba Mitra has historicized and excavated as deviant female sexuality in South Asian colonial archives, or what she cleverly calls the Indian sex life. Hum translates to multiple meanings: same, we, and the honorific I. The term jins translates to sex, and the term parast means relations, but also means worshiper or a devotee. The term parast is often used in the term but parast, which means worshipping of idols. While hum jins parast can be read as same-sex relations, for me the phrase also speaks to the capacious movement between feminine, masculine, sacred, sexual, and erotic desires. Hum jins parast, as worshipping or following multiple desires and multiple divinities, demonstrates that these desires and divinities cannot be captured in fixed categories of sexual orientation. Like zenana, I read hum jins parast closely and incessantly for all of its many hidden meanings. Intimacy of bodies, women becoming women with other women, women becoming women between women, women enjoying, desiring, laboring for, and wanting women, and ultimately about women worshiping women. If we take seriously the many meanings of hum as both we and I, then hum allows us to think about the self as not separated or a separable I. Rather, the self, hum, is a relationality with the other we, where the self and the other are not separable bodies, but rather co-constitutive and always in relation. Hum disrupts the register of I. Hum jins parast offers a deviant grammar of desire and love, where desire and love is routed through multiple relations with the self and sacred. Theorizing hum jins parast as a relationality, as a spirituality, as queer erotics, allows me to disassemble the very idea that the self exists as an independent entity, a Cartesian enterprise devoid of relationality to others, to space, and to spirituality. These multiple meanings of hum jins parast are central to my understanding of zenana. The zenana is haunted by and sticky with these meaning and homosociality and homoerotics between women. The women in my zenana would never identify as lesbians, yet it is among them, in this space and through this utterance, that I learned how to be and become a lesbian. I read their intimacies, their socialities, their relationalities as a form of politics rooted in survival, class affinity, and conditional choice. I learned to read and understand sexuality not as simply as an identity, but rather as a relations and rituals of pleasure, labor, pain, beauty, and play that are ultimately entangled with feminine divinity and destruction of human-centric and androcentric worlds. These are the different genealogies and cultural grammars that contour my thinking of zenana. In these fleshy hetero rituals of zenana afternoons, I was learning a divine mother tongue, a lesbian tongue, a feminist tongue, and all the promiscuous ways women move in and out of the world, not always of their making and choosing. This is perhaps why my mother calls me a miti churi, which means sweet knife, and why my grandmother would tell me, "Tari zaban bahut tez thai gayi che," your tongue has become too sharp. The rooms and afternoons the women in my family created, exploited, disassembled, and recreated through capital allowed them the ability to move between a range of desires and the multiple registers of desire. For me, the zenana and my mother's evocation of the term lesbian was collapsing the binaries often drawn between the body and the soul, the sexual and the sacred, power and precarity, the domestic and the deviant, them and me. Learning from Audre Lorde, I want to ask, can zenana offer us a new spelling for lesbian desires, sacred intimacies, and differently activated and assembled brown femininities? Zenana and Hamjins parast are spaces and vernaculars that challenge and undo the Orientalist and colonial historicizing that designates sexuality in Pakistan to a conservative and closeted repression or a romanticized fetishistic ars erotica. In getting intimate with these vernaculars and these spatialities, I'm able to get at the messy, contradictory, and difficult work required to theorize brown femininities that are made and unmade between bittersweet and sticky histories of empire, sexuality, beauty, biological essentialism, divine erotics, and Black and brown diasporas. My particular comfort with women comes from somewhere. My desire to retain or remove hair comes from somewhere. My training in lightness and the right kind of brownness comes from somewhere. My search for different deviant grammars comes from somewhere. This somewhere is both spatial and sexual, transnational and local. It is imbued with intergenerational violence and trauma. It is the left behind theater where my own feminism gets challenged and reshaped. When I return to my mother's tongues in these zenanas, I see the limits of theorizing about brown women who love brown women, the inefficiencies in the architecture and acquisition of language, and the overdetermination of theoretical and cultural vernaculars that draw lines around how we conceive brownness, femininity, and desire. Let me close by offering something. Let me close by saying that for me as a brown queer thinker, queerness is less the unknown horizons many scholars refer to as queer futures. Instead, my interest is in turning backwards, feeling inwards, and theorizing across. I return to the home and the zenana that has always been here, shaping us, unseen, unnamed. I look for a new spelling. I look for a new way to spell this name. Thank you.
Wow. Okay, so I have to take all of that in. That was fantastic. So what I'm going to say to everybody that's here is that we're going to enter into our question and answer period now. And so the best way to, I think, keep track of this is if you just type in the chat that you have a question. You don't have to type your question, just type that you have one. And then I'm going to call you and I'm going to ask you to ask the question yourself. So you'll have to unmute yourself and ask the question because we want to see you. We want to be with you in this moment. And maybe as people are doing that, what I will do is ask a question to get us started. And so those of you that want to follow up, please do type just question in the chat and then I will see that. So Sara, I'm really blown away. I thought that was an incredibly smart and also really affectively moving piece. And so thank you so much for sharing it with us today. I learned a lot and it made me feel a lot. And so I just want to ask a general question to get us started, which, there is, as you note, and you're pretty careful about throughout, there is, an available feminist critique here of something like zenana, as a space of gender segregation, as you called it, a space of gender training, as you also describe. But that's not where you end up, like with the critique. In fact, that's where you start, to sort of state your understanding about, how zenana operates in this way. But then by sort of so firmly placing yourself as an experiential subject in and of zenana, you rescript that with so much more nuance and contour, that ends up generating all different kinds of readings. And my question really is a simple one, which was, what's at stake for you in making that deliberate choice to approach zenana in this way?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dana. That's a great question. I mean, that's why I think so I've been working on this project for about, I think probably my whole life, but if one was to think in a scholarly way, probably for 2 years. And I think, for me, I think what's at stake is how we think about all these frames of identity. I think about gender, sexuality, class, caste, color. I think what is fascinating for me in the context of Pakistan is that we often go back to thinking about the frames of how respectable womanhood are made. And I think, funny enough, that was my dissertation work. And, my beautiful dissertation chair, Jazz, is here, who helped me kind of think about I was really trying to understand in that work how to think about the making of respectable Pakistani womanhood. And I think I was thinking about it through figurations, right? The modestly modern woman, the empowered Muslim woman, the new kind of trans policy that is passed in Pakistan in 2018 that is empowering trans subjects, and obviously and courtersan, and it's called the Trans Bill in 2018. And I think, I feel like we all do this. We all look at our work that we've done, and I saw like there was both room to rethink some of these. But I think for me, I think what's at stake is space, right? None of these things are made in abstract, right? They're made within these spaces. So I think what the project is really trying to do, and I'm still grappling with it, I'm still wrestling with some of these ideas, is how are these frames of femininity, or what we call woman, made in these spaces, right? And zenana is such a rich and messy term, because historically the zenana was protected by courtesans and trans bodies, but also by bodies called Urdu begis, which is a term that hasn't been really worked on, at least from I understand. And these were women warriors and women like more that were protecting the zenana. So, right, so this idea that you have this space that was historically seen as one thing and then became one thing post the Pakistani nation. But what actually happens in these spaces, right? Like, and I think for me, it's also interesting to think about how one learns ways to be in this world, right? And I think for me, the ways to be in this world is sometimes it has to be an exit, right? But exit is not always possible for a lot of people. Whatever you're exiting from, right? So for me, it's about really thinking about the complexity in which I learned a lot of these things. And I think a lot of people have learned these things. So I think for me at the stake is really about thinking about how people love, and how do we really think about how do we learn how to love in these spaces. But this way to love is also very complicated, because we've decided love is a very particular kind of heterosexual romantic love, of course, for a variety of reasons. But then I had to go back. I had to be like, I'm not interested in theorizing ways that I'm interested in critiquing the women that raised me, but I'm not interested in completely detaching from them, which means detaching from histories and so many different things. It's not just these women, right?
Yeah, yes, thank you so much. The questions are building up, so I'm gonna go to them. And so I'll ask you to unmute and just ask your question. So there's a question here from Anjali Arandikar. Are you here, Anjali?
Yes, I am. Salam, Sara. Shukriya. That was very, very good. It's great to see everyone. So I'm a historian of sexuality, as you know. So when I was listening to you, I was thinking this is one Zenana mission I would sign up for, as opposed to those horrible colonial Zenana missions that we love to hate. So my question is about something that you gestured to, and it may not be what you're interested in, but I'd certainly like to learn more, is the question of Islam. And the reason why I'm asking that is that you took great care to think about Zenana as an epistemology that extends and stretches into places of speculation and possibility. But the overdetermination of Islam / Muslim women is one of the sort of architectures that holds the Zenana as a space of peril, right? So I wanted to hear a little bit more about how your readings also forces us to imagine a different hermeneutics of Islam that is not necessarily I mean, I'm thinking obviously of my dear friend Sabah Mahmood's work, but a lot of other people. And I was really inspired because I noticed this when we were together in Lahore as well, the last time, that was the spirit of the moment. So I was wondering if you could sort of intertwine this capacious hermeneutics of the Zenana with also a very capacious understanding of Islam as a lived experience, particularly in Pakistan. So whatever you fancy, but thank you.
No, I think that's a fantastic question and something I think I continue to grapple with. I always, my first go-to when I think about Islam in Pakistan is that the very name of the nation is Pak, meaning pure, and pure nation. And then in the 1970s, 1980s, the Pakistani woman becomes analogous, right, to the Muslim woman. So I think what I'm trying to do here is really to sort of think about exactly like you said, right? Like what are the everyday practices of Islam where I learned Islam, right? So there's a piece, part of this talk is coming out in a journal, and I play with exactly what you're asking, right? And what you're craving and kind of thinking through is this idea of the play between Zenana, or thinking about Zenana more capaciously and Islam more capaciously. And I think part of it is what happens in a lot of the scholarship, and I'm hoping this is going to be, I'll have more time to think about this work and write more about this, is exactly to do that, is go back and be like, who is this Muslim woman that we have decided that we already know about, right? And what does Islam mean to people like different people, right? Different people in different communities. What has Islam meant? Because it has also been deployed as a site of resistance. And it has many ways of understanding what religiosity is, right? And I think in terms of South Asia, what often gets sidelined is that the South Asian Islam is a very particular kind of Islam, right? That emerges from the shrine culture, that emerges in coagulation and entanglements with Hinduism, which basically was made into a religion by the British, right? So the Islam that I grew up with is not this kind of one Islam, right? It's a very particular Islam, which has a lot of Hindu rituals, a lot of Parsi rituals. So part of what I'm trying to do in this work is to piece out some of these. And also within Islam, there's so many different sects, right? There's Ismaili. So I am part of a community of Shia Muslims that are called Aga Khanis that still trace their lineage to a particular kind of Shiaism, right? And so that kind of Islam is seen as the liberal Islam. So then you get a lot of, so a lot of what you're saying is something I'm thinking about, I'm thinking through, and also thinking through in ways that a lot of scholars are. I think which is interesting right now is I think Sabah Mahmood and so many other scholars that kind of laid the groundwork are now allowing a lot of younger scholars to think about Sufism and Islam, thinking about the kind of also spatial politics of how Islam becomes both embodied, both a site of resistance, but also ways of practicing that's more lyrical, more musical, more poetics, right? So it's really thinking about the poetics of Islam that I'm trying to get at in my work versus like, this person said namaz and this person said dua, but really thinking about within Islam, the poetics within the Pakistani context was deliberately taken out, like arts and performances were taken out, right? So I'll end there, but thank you. I'm totally thinking about that. Thank you.
That's excellent. There's a question from Jazz. I think it's from Jazz.
Yeah, it is. And, you know, it's less of a question, of course, as it is like, Sara, tell us more about what you're thinking about. At the end of your talk, you turn relatively quickly to say that your sort of zenana theorizing is distinguished from situating sexuality or queerness or whatever as a horizon, and rather thinking about interiors and domesticities, etc., as a kind of turn to the space of becomings and sexualities that that you're, you know, sort of opening up or possibly closing in on when you introduce the idea of zenana. So I just want to hear you talk a bit more about that. Why make that distinction? What does that mean to you? What else does that open up or enclose?
So just say a little bit more. Yeah, can you say a little bit more? I think I'm a little confused.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, basically at the end of your talk, you were like, you know, this zenana theorizing that you're introducing is not situating sexuality or utopia at a horizon, let's just say.
Okay.
Right? So you're not thinking about queer horizons, you're thinking about queer interiors or something much more capacious and fascinatingly robust than queer interiors, but you're thinking about interiors, domesticities, turning, etc. Okay,
absolutely. And I think I think what I struggle with often, right, is this idea that we and it's the movement back and forth, right? Like, so one of the things I'm thinking about is both what the possibilities of this theorizing allows us to do, but, and then rather than thinking about that as separate, right? Like this idea that there is this horizon that's separate versus this horizon that we leave, not horizon, but this backspace or history we leave behind. I think what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to put it together, because I think I feel like this investment in a kind of futurity that I'm reading and I'm very seduced by, absolutely very seduced by. I feel like that is thinking about the futurities invested in a particular kind of newness. And I think for me, that is both interesting, but also limiting, because I think part of the futurity has to incorporate, or at least engage, right? If not incorporate, engage the realities that have existed, right? So this idea that there's one way that we can think about the queer futures or the feminist futures, or this idea that it's always been about sexuality, right? So this idea of using sexuality to do that kind of melding or blending work that I'm interested in doing, because it's, and I say this because part of what I'm fascinated by is that how do people learn how to love? Like, how are we thinking about this future, this speculation, without engaging with within which these spaces and ideas and spaces were created, right? So of course, there's some disruptions, there's some exits needed, there's some reimagining needed. So part of it is that back and forth that I'm trying to do.
Yeah. This is a question from Muhammad Karam, and I think they prefer that I ask it. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I wanted to ask about the implications of telling the story of the zenana, the responsibility of telling this story, how you experienced and translated it in your work here. Do you need me to repeat that? So, you know, what are the implications of telling the story and the responsibility of telling the story?
Yeah, no, this is a question is really beautiful, because I think there is a really deep responsibility here, right? Part of what I am really trying to do is, in many ways, is to think about theorizing about sexual violence without creating, you know, some kind of erotic trauma porn, right? Because that is obviously both disrespectful and not my project. I think what I'm interested in doing is thinking about the quotidian ideas of violence, how violence becomes what it becomes in the everyday. And I think I'm so thankful for this question because part of what initially when I was thinking about this, I really thought about where do I start these kind of conversations? Like what's my entry point? What's my lens? And I thought the only person I think that I can kind of, make naked if I would be so in a very coarse way is myself. So I think in order to get at the violences of respectable femininity is part of really thinking about the making of my own body, right? So I think part of it is absolutely there's a responsibility, there's a respect, and part of it is thinking about these stories and thinking about them as stories actually, because and funny enough, my mom is not on here, but she had a solo show of this performance of today. But part of it is actually being in conversation with people in my family, women in my family, to think about where they were coming from, right? So part of it is not to tell a story that doesn't have layers and layers to it, right? And I think part of it is I'm hoping that I'm doing it responsibly, and I'm hoping I'm doing it with utmost care, because this is also very difficult work to be doing. So I think I'll end there, but absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so there is now a question here from Harpreet Chulia. Are you here, Harpreet?
I am. Thank you very much, Sara, first of all, for giving a type of language to certain things that one has been growing up with and has been socialized in. Thanks a lot for that, first of all. I feel very inspired by your talk. And I've kind of got, I think all of you know this kind of situation where you've kind of got two questions and you're trying to formulate a way to ask it. So I've got kind of two half questions, and it kind of links to the question before. I can relate it back to the research I've done, because I'm an urban sociologist and I work on gender diaspora, South Asian diaspora and club culture. So I've looked at how different South Asian communities have started to stake claim in the club scenes in London, be that in heteronormative spaces and in queer spaces. And I remember both from my own positionality, working out how to kind of tell us different stories from differently positioned people, not just along the lines of queerness, but also on the lines of religion, caste, class, and stuff like that. So for me, that the question is, because I've also finished my dissertation, but this kind of difficulty, the ethical implications of sharing stories, doing ethnographic research. I just kind of wanted to hear a little bit more of that, if that's possible, how that was for you. But you've kind of answered that in the previous question. And also, I'm thinking of questions of spatiality and the politics of spatiality, and how, just to hear a bit about how different spaces were claimed in the place and settings you were within. Because in my research, I know that there were certain people who were positioned, let's say, aspiring middle class, who were performing and claiming space in different parts of London. And at the same time, other people that were in other spaces. I don't know, I just wanted to kind of hear a little bit about that. I mean, does that make sense, what I'm asking?
Totally.
Yeah,
No, thank you. I think part of what, it's so interesting you're talking about positionality and the politics of space, right? And also this idea of the mobility of class. I think what's really interesting in the context that I'm thinking about my work is that if I'm like our family, like during partition, a lot of Ismailis moved from India to Pakistan, right? So I often think about the what happens when we think about the making of a new nation, the kind of changing of class, and then what that class forces you to do, right? What kind of to use your language, how do you start to claim spaces? How do you kind of become upwardly mobile? And in becoming upwardly mobile, you are both using, but also kind of stepping away from spaces that might have been your spaces before. So absolutely, I think what is fascinating about the Pakistani context is 1970s, 80s onwards, I'm thinking about that time period, class dynamic changes dramatically, right? So I think what is fascinating is the country is becoming both, I mean, we're going through a phase of, I mean, one could argue Pakistan itself is a neoliberal construction, but like you're going through kind of hyper neoliberalization, 1970s onwards, and then the class dynamics are changing. So here, this is also where I think about a joint family, right? So growing up in a house where there's multi-generational, there's multiple generations living in one, and then there's migration for different reasons, and there's movement back. So the notion of family gets disrupted, the notion of class mobility gets disrupted, the idea of multiple citizenship gets disrupted. But this is a very, like, thinking about it from a very particular class dynamic, right? So thinking about, rather than, studying down, I'm kind of trying to study up, right? To be like, how is the notion of elite actually constructed, right? And we have this idea of that and this brings me back to all these newer Netflix shows on, the fabulous lives of Bollywood wives and Bling Empire, which I refuse to watch, but I should at some point. But really thinking about, how do we study power, right? So I think this is such a great question, Harpreet, because part of what I'm trying to do is think about power in different ways, right? So thinking about both the how power is used, but then how power is created in these spaces, and constantly changes, right? Constantly changes. Thank you for your question.
So there's lots of questions. Do you need some water? I just feel like, feel free to take a water break and sip water as we go, because lots of people want to talk. So Mariam Durrani, are you here?
Yes, hi. Hi.
Hi, Mariam.
Hi, Sara. Thank you so much. This was so fantastic. I wanted to continue talking about, there's a couple threads that I wanted to think through, and just to situate myself, I'm an anthropologist, so I was really interested in how you were describing the practices, right? Specifically talking about, for example, sugaring and the connection between, sugar and like the global kind of sugar trade, with kind of, connected to slavery, connected to indentured labor. So I was thinking about the other part where you talked about getting threaded in Toronto and experiencing a certain kind of like affective, like, similarity between, zenana in Pakistan in the 80s and Toronto today. And I wanted to ask a little bit more about the way the idea of like the Muslim woman, within a global context, especially now with like the war on terror going on for almost 20 years, how we might think about kind of like the Muslim woman as creating or drawing on particular practices that situate her within this larger historical context that otherwise, again, is not seen in that particular way, especially given obviously like the racist kind of like stereotyping and of Muslims. And so I wanted to hear a little bit more about those connections. I feel like there's it's a set of themes, it's not really a question. So I'm just kind of thinking a little bit more about the relationship of zenana to empire, for example, and thinking about how kind of imperial formations are also kind of shaping what's happening within and that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that's why part of why I was, going back and forth in this talk, both Life Now and, going back and forth is precisely to get at that, right? Because the zenana of 1980s Pakistan is situated in a very different kind of imperial history and post-colonial history, right? And the zenanas that, I'm trying to cultivate or think about or theorize about are within a very different kind of spatial politics of imperialism and empire in a very different way. So I think part of what I feel like the whole idea of this category of Muslim women, I feel like so many other scholars, I think, do a much better job than I do. But I think for me, it's not so much the idea of, it's about thinking about how femininity is both, the training of femininity is both really fucked up, but also is something that I'm attached to. So part of what I'm actually trying to get at is the kind of embodied formations, right? So in many ways, this work is really thinking about how is one undoing some of the things that one has already learned, right? So thinking about threading, like you said, in the Toronto Salon, like this reminds me of a film, a Lebanese film that is called, I think, Sticky Sugar or something. And it's basically this story of 4 women in a beauty salon. And they're basically thinking through these kind of what are considered heterosexual ideas of femininity, right? And so I don't know if I'm getting at your question, but I think for me, it's about thinking about both whiteness, right? Like how my Toronto salon is marketing sugaring as, by the way, they offer it for free for those of you that live in Toronto. I know they're closed right now, but they offer your first sugaring is free, right? Because most people don't know what sugaring is. And so I myself had to recently learn what sugaring was, because I was like waxing, stories on waxing. And then, one of my interlocutors was like, the story is about sugaring. And I was like, oh my God, like, this is so fascinating, right? So part of it is we use these terms and they're connected. Like I think the sugaring of my childhood zenana versus the threading or waxing that I do here, they're equally complicated, right? They're not like, it's not more streamlined here than it's there. It's equally complicated.
Yeah. There's another question from Asad Alvi. Are you here, Asad?
Hello. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Asad. Hello.
Hi, Sara. How are you?
I'm good.
That was such a lovely talk. Thank you. I actually had a fairly simple question. So there was this amazing attentiveness throughout your talk to words, Urdu words, hum jins parast, and then the word zenana also, and then the laddu phrase, which I've heard so many times. But I was actually wondering about your relationship to Gujarati and if that differs from your relationship with Urdu, if it differs at all. So that was my first question. And another thing that I was just wondering about is when you're using words as method almost, you stop, you hear a certain word, and then you start thinking about treating words as sources of knowing or epistemology. I just wanted to know in general your relationship to language. How do you inhabit it? Do you hear a word and then you'll stop and then you start thinking about it? And how does that register, on the body in that kind of a way? Yeah, just that. So those two things. Thank you, and I love you.
I love you too. So those of you that know Asad is beautiful poet from Karachi, and we're always in conversation about language, and is often my go-to person for translations or even thinking about translation. So I love your question. So I'll try to answer the first question around relationship to Urdu and Gujarati. So I find that my relationship to Urdu and Gujarati both have kind of a different space, I think. So, I was trained both, in school, I was trained in English, but also in Urdu, because in going to school in Karachi, Urdu classes were mandatory. But Gujarati very quickly, right? So I think what's happening here is also kind of the making of the nation. So Gujarati becomes not a language that is being trained, students are not being trained at it in school. So my Gujarati lessons were actually happening at home, but they were not seen as necessary, even though everybody spoke Gujarati. So, and Gujarati is both the language that both sets of my parents' family spoke, right? So I could understand it, but I couldn't speak it. Very similarly to my engagement with the Quran, like I read in Arabic, but I didn't understand it. So my relationship to Gujarati was kind of converse, where I could understand it, but I couldn't read it, and I couldn't speak it fluently. But it was always a language of intimacy. It was always a language of gossip. Like, it's a language I constantly heard in the house. Whereas my relationship to Urdu, I think, is more about authenticity, if I was to be, truly frank, because I think when the nation was created in 1947, a very small segment of society spoke Urdu, right? So Urdu went from being the language of poetics to the language of the bazaar to the language of the state, right? And then it becomes a language of the state, and then it also becomes language of respectability. So part of my, and this is kind of entering into your second question, part of my relationship to Urdu is not to think about this authentic way of speaking in Urdu, because fuck that shit, as if language can ever be authentic, right? So, but it's to think about words and phrases that have so many meanings, and these aphorisms that we keep using in the everyday life. And then I'm like, what is going on here, right? So there's that. I think I'll say a couple of things about Gujarati too. I think Shelja Patel's work on Gujarati is really beautiful, where they're thinking about phrases and queerness and Afro-Asian intimacies around language. So it's not, I feel like my relationship to language is a betrayal, actually, because I don't think there's any language, like this idea that I can speak in one language more beautifully than the other. I was trained in multiple languages and I feel inadequate in all of them.
I'm going to ask another question. I'm so struck by your answers, and I need to sort of take them in before I can continue to moderate the conversation. But here's a question from Sabahat Zara, and I think they'd like me to ask it for them because they've typed it here. So when you talk about becoming a lesbian and the ways in which we learn to love in certain space, I'm curious as to how this theorization can be misused to encourage the narrative that Subat, is that the S-U-H-B-A-T? Can you see it in there? Subat?
Sohbat, okay.
Yeah. Thank you. The surroundings we put ourselves in and are put in can make someone a lesbian, and that extending that can be used to justify conversion therapy in a way. What can be learned can be unlearned, basically. How do we avoid falling into this narrative while also articulating the ways in which spaces and places and people do make us who we are and give us ways to love?
Beautiful question, Sabaha. Thank you. I do think about that a lot, actually. So we should definitely chat more. I think part of, and what's a good translation of sohbat in English?
Sabaha? So I did write it in,
sorry.
So it could be like the surroundings that you're put in and that you put yourself in.
Okay. So I think, yeah, great. And I think part of it is exactly the zenana, right? The zenana, I think, was made, is a space where you learn heterosexuality, right? And I think the beautiful short story Lihaf of 1942, which was the inspiration behind the film Fire by Deepa Mehta. For those of you who haven't seen it, you should see it. And then the most recent Bollywood film, Date Ishqiya. This idea that the zenana, right? The spaces, the zenana space was not a space where you learn how to, it's a space you learn how to be a heterosexual, respectable woman, right? But my point is, what spaces do you learn queerness? It's like this idea that we have this space is for this, and then this space is for this. So part of what I struggle with, and the struggle is both, I hear what you're saying about sohbat. So this idea of what spaces allow us, I'm really trying to, because this is something I've thought about so much, and I'm going to have to think about it some more, but I struggle with that. I struggle that this work is going to be picked up in a way that is like, of course, this house was full of, whatever it was, right? Is where she learned this. But part of, I think, in telling that is to show that there's no such thing as a space that is not, is apolitical or asexual. This idea that a space can be asexual in itself is is a myth, right? So this space that was meant for one thing other things happened, right? And why I think that's why the word between is where the in between, because this is not a theorization of the zenana, you know? This is a theorization of what I learned in these zenanas, right? So it's not that these women were trying to teach me how to be any certain way other than being marriage material, right? Which, by the way, I was, and I you know, like, so part of it is the in-betweenness. So how does one co-opt the in-betweenness, right? I don't know. I'm thinking about that more. But thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
There's a question from Aktas Aptab. Are you here, Aktas?
Aktas.
Hi, yes, I'm here. I was avoiding turning my camera on because I'm in a blanket
I'm sorry.
jacket.
Oh. Do you want me to read it?
Oh, no worries. No, I can say it now. I can say it. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sara. Your talk was so beautiful and so many things resonated so deeply with me. I have a question that might be out of the scope of your work, so please tell me if it's irrelevant. I was wondering, what is the relationship between the queer feminine spaces that so many men inhabit within Sufi cultures like the Qawwali or the Ghazal, with the kind of the zenanas that you mentioned. So you specifically mentioned the sort of like very cis woman centric zenanas, and I'm wondering, what is the relationship between these women centric spaces with the spaces that different queer men or men who are functioning within queer spaces are forming as they experiment with femininity?
Thank you, Agnes. I think that question is totally relevant. I think one of the things I'm trying to do in this work is to precisely move between multiple makings of the zenana, right? So I think part of what I've started to do, I think, is to think about the heterosexual elite zenanas, cishet zenanas that I was raised in, right? So to think about that in a way to juxtapose it to other zenanas, right? Like, so the idea of other forms of zenana is what I'm hoping to sort of weave through this work, because it's not simply, right, like you know, to use your words, it's not just queer men making zenanas, but it's also actually people calling themselves zenanas, right? So this idea that this word carries so much weight, right, and so much meaning, to think about that, I begin with the cis elite zenana to kind of work through a critique of both post-colonial heterosexuality, to then kind of open it up to be like, this was just one zenana, but if space is always fraught, right, and power is always there, then how do we create other forms of zenanas, right? Or not even other forms of zenana, I'm talking about in my own life, but there's so many other zenanas out there, which is not my entry point, because I think my entry point is to actually get at the elite, the classed heterosexual space of the zenana, of the upper middle class respectability space, right? So, but absolutely, I'm thinking through not so much about queer men specifically in what you're talking about, but absolutely being in conversation with how different scholars and artists and activists are thinking about zenana. So thank you.
Thank you.
So there's, yes, thank you, Aftab. I'm sorry to make you, I didn't know you didn't want to come. There's one last question, which is good because we only have time for about one more question. And so we'll ask that. And it's from Christine Salik. Are you here, Christine?
I am. I'm right here. I had a question. I'm still trying to kind of wrap my head around things. I'm a very baby undergrad academic, still trying to figure it out.
Thank you for joining us.
Of course, thank you. I would not miss this at all. So I had a question about, because I know that the zenana and like a lot of these terms, a lot of these Urdu Persian terms are based in like kind of Islam and the culture surrounding. And I'm wondering, bringing like the positionality of a Christian Pakistani person, I was wondering if you feel that the zenana and these concepts would be applicable to minority queer women in Pakistan, specifically like Christian Pakistani women, Hindu Pakistani women, Buddhist Pakistani women, and the like.
Thank you, Christine. So Christine, a shout out for you and all the students that have shown up. I'm teaching a class called Sexing South Asia this semester, and all the students are fantastic and brilliant. And so I'm so happy that you're here and asking this important question, because absolutely, I mean, I think the way I'm thinking about zenana is, you know, to work off of the answers I gave earlier around language. I think the idea of zenana is both, is really thinking about the domestic space, right? And in the context of my work, I'm thinking about, you know, to go back to what Anjali was asking me, the entanglements of femininity, brownness in Islam in many ways, right? And I think part of what is interesting about kind of the question that you're asking is predominantly what I'm trying to kind of, it's the critique that I'm doing of my elite zenana, right? So the elite zenana, like a lot of the waxing walis that used to come to our house were Christian. So this idea that it was on their working class and religious minority dynamic in Pakistan, as we know, is a little different, right? Christians and Hindus are minorities, and so that dynamic is very different. So I think absolutely it's something that I have to think through. I don't know if I'm like, I don't see this work as a critique of, how should I say this? I think what I'm interested in the actual word and what the word can do and how that word allows us to create a different kind of spatial politics. But what I'm hoping that will come and in conversation with a lot of you is to think about it in different ways. So I think the zenana that I'm trying to like really critique is the majoritarian zenanas of Pakistan, right? That are seen as the kind of ideal zenanas of Pakistan. And I'm saying even in the ideal, there are all of these layers that we need to think through, right? Around power and class and caste. So yes, I feel like the different zenanas will have different relationalities to power, right? And in Pakistan specifically, I think a Christian family in the zenana there, if even they call it there, right? Like, so part of it is I'm not really saying, okay, this is a Christian zenana in a Christian household, because that is also imposing terms that are not used or terms that are not applicable or terms that are not useful in their context, or it might be, right? So rather than saying this is a Pakistani zenana, I'm saying this is a zenana that I grew up in, and these are the layers of the analysis.
Yeah. Okay, well, we've come to the end of our event, sadly, because it's been so wonderful. And so I would like to thank all of you for joining us. There are people that have come here from all over. And it's really just remarkable to be able to see you. And so thank you for joining us. And most of all, I would like to thank Dr. Shroff for sharing her work with us today. And I really look forward to seeing the project as it continues to evolve. And I'm so thrilled that we have this postdoctoral fellowship at the Bonham Centre, so we can bring scholars like yourself to come here and generate these kinds of ideas in the world. So thank you so very much. And goodbye and good night, or good morning, I don't know, to the rest of you. Take good care.
Thank you. Thank you.